Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Manny Rutinel, and I'm a student here at Yale Law School. So happy to see so many folks tuning in to this panel on market consolidation and how it relates to animal welfare. I think you're in for a fascinating set of panelists with important additions to make in this space. As I'm sure many of you know, the factory farming of animals is one of the largest sources of suffering on the planet. America alone raises and kills over 10 billion land animals each year, 99% of which were raised on large factory farms. These numbers are truly impossible to wrap one's head around. Instead, I think it's better to think about a single piglet, born to a mother who spent essentially her whole life unable to move inside of a small cage, constantly impregnated and giving milk to her young, as if she were a lifeless machine. The piglet then experiences a series of mutilations without anesthetics and is then forced to experience the same isolated and confined fate as her mother before getting sent to slaughter. That same suffering exists for chickens, turkeys, fish, and cows across the industry. The issue of animal welfare looks to be one of the most important issues of our time, and its importance cannot be overstated. The panelists before us bring perspectives that both point to the consolidation of power by a handful of meat companies as a source of suffering for animals, as well as perspectives that hope to leverage the consolidation of these companies for the benefit of animal welfare. Our first presentation will be held by Liz Hallinan. Liz Hallinan is the founder and executive director of the Greenfield Project, a nonprofit dedicated to cultivating a more joyful and resilient food system. Our second presentation will be held by Dan Scheitrum and Aleks Schaefer. Dr. Dan Scheitrum is an assistant professor in the Agricultural and Resource Economics Department at the University of Arizona. Dr. Aleks Schaefer is an assistant professor in agricultural and food policy in the Department of Agricultural, Food, and Resource Economics at Michigan State University. Our third presentation will be held by Daina, Bray, and Owen Pell. Daina Bray is General Counsel of Mercy for Animals, a global farmed animal protection nonprofit, and previously served as General Counsel of the International Fund for Animal Welfare. Owen Pell is a retired partner of counsel with White & Case LLP and has handled major cases in the area of corporate social responsibility, including as to World War II and the Holocaust, South Africa during the apartheid era, and African slavery in the United States. And before we move to our first presenter, Liz Hallinan, who will be discussing their paper, Animal Welfare and Big Ag, How Industry Concentration Hurts Animals and Stifles Sustainable Farming, I want to remind everyone that if you have a question during one of the presentations, please submit it to me using Zoom's chat feature so I can read it during the Q&A. You can access the chat in the control bar at the bottom of your Zoom window. Please also remember to keep yourself muted for the entire panel unless you are asked to unmute when you raise your hand, for instance. Thank you. Take it away, Liz.
Okay, you can hear me, Manny? Great. Okay, let's try to share screen. This is what I want. All right, hopefully everyone can see that. All right, there we go. Well, thanks so much for having me here. I'm going to talk about animal welfare and big ag concentration and how I see these as related. Manny gave me a great introduction, thank you. I just also want to mention that we focus primarily on US farm animal welfare policy in the US, and so that's kind of the angle that we're coming from. So our paper is focused on the idea of how animal welfare is affected by animal ag concentration. And the reason we took this angle is I think that traditionally animal welfare advocates haven't really thought about industry concentration as a particularly relevant consideration when thinking about how to improve the lives of animals. And excuse me. And at Greenfield Project, we've been kind of looking at this issue and trying to map on why animal welfare advocates should care and know about the concentration that's happened in the animal ag industry. And so we have three arguments in our paper. Our claim is that the industry concentration itself has made the lives of animals worse than they need to be in the farm system. It's made it harder to be a farmer who treats animals well, and it convinces consumers to pay for products that are products of massive suffering, and sometimes pay more. And then at the end of our paper, we discussed two approaches that this understanding that animal ag concentration affects animal welfare, that there are two approaches one might take to try to fix this, looking at how to improve animal welfare through the lens of industry concentration. And I think these two solutions are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but I do think there's some tension between them. So the first is the one that I think is most common or most popular right now in the animal welfare advocacy world, which is to pressure the big agribusinesses to make improvements to animal welfare without actually doing anything about the concentration or to change the business model of these big corporations. And the second is to use better regulations or antitrust principles to break up the grip of these large companies in order to let smaller farmers who are using better practices sort of flourish and let consumers have more choice as to the kind of products they buy. Okay, so our first argument is that industry concentration makes the lives of animals worse. I'm mostly going to I'm sort of going to explain the problem of animal welfare in this concentrated industry through the lens of broiler chickens. Those are the chickens that you eat, like chicken breasts or wings, because they both kind of pioneered the vertical integration that we see in a lot of these companies, and it's also the one I'm just most familiar with. So when you have a broiler chicken integrator, they basically control the entire arc of the animal's life. The only part of the broiler chicken's experience that is outsourced from, say, a company like Tyson or Purdue is when they're given to poultry growers, who are these sort of independent contractors, in theory, farmers who take the chicks in when they're babies and raise them to slaughter age, and then the integrator comes and picks them up and takes them to slaughter. So even from the beginning of determining what animals are grown and what their life is going to be like, the integrators control that. So they control the breeding. Only a handful of genetics companies breed only a small handful of animal types. And the way that breeding is done is to maximize productivity, things like feed conversion ratios. And as a result, you have an animal that from birth is basically destined to suffer because it is designed to maximize productivity and maximize breast meat and maximize how quickly it can grow on how little feed. So even from the beginning, the way that most animals are raised in this country through the vertical integration system, through this massive corporation system, even from the beginning, just determining which animals are born and what their lives are like is coming from a very small percentage of companies looking at a very specific outcome for their lives. So after they're born and they're dropped off as chicks to these growers, the integrators themselves control the living conditions of these animals. So the raising of the animals are outsourced to these growers, but the growers are told exactly what environment to give these animals, what food to give these animals, how much water, what the temperature is, everything that these animals would experience is determined by the integrators. So even a grower who wants to make their life better for animals can't do it because it's controlled by this big agribusiness in terms of what the animal actually experiences. And then the integrators and the regulators control the slaughter process too. So the big integrators, the big companies have slaughterhouses that determines the experience that the animal is going to have through slaughter. And small independent facilities that do sort of more individualized slaughter are basically incredibly hard to find and difficult to schedule. So again, this is the idea that the integrators control the experience of the animal from birth to death all the way through. Okay, so now we say let's support the independent farmers who would care and put more money and time and effort into making the animals have a better experience. It's incredibly hard for independent farmers to get money to support their sustainable high welfare farm. And I don't have much time to get into the details here, but you can see from the slide and from the paper that just a massive amount of money goes towards the land and the equipment for these growers that are associated with the big big companies and not with independent farmers. Also, the big companies dominate the supermarket. So it looks like there are tons of products in the market. Lots of them say things like free range and cage free, but actually most of those products are coming from the few small number of big businesses. And so if you're an independent small farmer and you're trying to show people that you treat your animals better and your animals are really on pasture and they eat organic grain and any sort of extra that you put towards your animals, you basically have to do everything yourself. You have to find your market, you have to educate your consumers, you have to come up with your own marketing in addition to being a great farmer. Okay, so let's instead have consumer pressure. We want consumers who care about their food to buy the products that support the better types of farming. I won't go into this. I believe this was talked about earlier, but basically the integrators have so much power in this market. They can even do things like set the prices in a way that there are so few of them that they can either indirectly or directly talk to each other about what consumers are even paying for the products that they're putting on the market. The big integrators and the regulators themselves make the law about what the labels say. So USDA in theory has an obligation to make sure that meat and poultry labeling is not false or misleading, but all the different accounts, including USDA's own Inspector General, plus a bunch of nonprofits, have talked about how USDA's labeling requirements are basically non-existent. And you can see this through things like Purdue marketing their broiler chickens as cage-free, which is sort of ridiculous because broiler chickens are never put in cages. So the idea that they're somehow special because they're cage-free is obviously incredibly misleading, but USDA is fine and lets them do that. Okay, so summing up, the effect of the concentration is these big companies control the breeds and therefore the experience of the animals. They control the raising and the access to slaughter. Even if an independent farmer would like to treat their animals better, they don't have any control over it. The integrators and the farmers that are associated with the integrators control a ton of access to the money they would need to have to start better farms, and they control the markets and the labeling. So consumers don't even have a choice of what they're buying unless they put a ton of effort into doing things like going out to the farmer's market to find better options. Okay, so what do we do about this? Well, so one camp is to say, okay, let's really push for antitrust and better regulations to break up the influence of these big banks. So have better fair farmer rules to make sure farmers have more control over their farms, make sure that independent farmers are prioritized when it comes to giving them capital and money, make sure the labeling rules are much clearer because it's very noisy out there and consumers don't know how to support better farming. The downsides of this, of course, is that we've been trying to do this for years and we haven't gotten very far. And animal welfare advocates, I think, probably don't like it as much because they can't directly influence, like, you will take your animals out of cages or you will put your animals on pasture. And the other thing is this is based on the assumption that consumers will care, that they will put money towards better products once they know how to identify them. So then the other way that the animal welfare advocacy groups have been doing this a lot recently is to say, look, there are only so many integrators we have to influence. If we just get Purdue and Tyson and Sanderson and Pilgrims to change their practices, then we can just affect billions and billions of birds' lives by having them say, okay, we're definitely going to put them on a pasture, or we're definitely going to have controlled atmosphere stunning for slaughter. The problem is that doesn't change this business model. It doesn't change the incredible power that these big integrators have. So the downside is while it might help animals, it doesn't help farmers. It doesn't change the prices or the options for the consumers. I have some concerns that there's this halo of marketing, like they say they're doing things better for animals, but they can sort of say that without actually making any changes. And another concern is if we find out that animal welfare can in fact be improved in a different way than we have made these companies make these promises, then we've sort of locked ourselves into that particular version of change. So anyway, that was very quick, but I think I'm out of time. So I will hand it back over.
Thank you so much for that excellent presentation, Liz. Our second presentation will be by Dr. Dan Scheitrum and Dr. K. Aleks Schaefer about their paper titled Animal Welfare Regulation and Market Concentration. Feel free to start whenever you're ready. Can't seem to hear anything.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. Sorry about that. I must have been on mute somehow. Okay, so I'm Dan Scheitrum of University of Arizona. This is work with Aleks Schaefer of Michigan State. And we are looking at animal welfare regulation and market concentration sort of in the other direction of the presentation we just saw. And I'm happy we get to follow that presentation because there's a lot of overlap and highlighting of the same issues. So there's common ground here. I think generally we all agree that consumers value the humane treatment of animals. Pretty much everyone who eats animal products cares that the animal that went into those products was being treated fairly and humanely as well as can be. But there's a dilemma in that production practices are determined by producers. Consumers don't have complete freedom to pick and choose exactly the production practices that go into all the products they consume. They have some ability to influence production practices by voting with their wallet, but that's limited because they can only choose from available options in the marketplace. And those consumers that care most strongly about animal welfare may abstain from purchasing animal products altogether, and they really relieve themselves of any ability to influence the market once they are out of the marketplace. And there's also a phenomenon we've observed that even though some of these enhanced animal welfare products are available for purchase, like cage-free eggs or free-range chicken, they're not consumed in large quantities. They don't make up a majority of the sales of these types of products. But even given that consumers don't buy cage-free eggs in large quantities or free-range chicken in large quantities, when given the opportunity to vote on an issue that mandates these practices, many consumers will vote to require these practices in place, even if they're not buying them when presented the option. And so current efforts to resolve animal welfare issues in animal product production are confinement practices, that is requiring larger cages for caged animals, allowing outside access, humane slaughter, transparency and legal protection of mistreated animals. In our paper, we're focusing solely on confinement practices. We have evidence from one particular example, and there are particulars about the economics of confinement practices that we model. And so we create an economic model. We're both economists. Aleks is also an attorney, but I'm not. And so we create an economic model that models if you impose animal welfare regulation, which has the impact of increasing fixed costs, i.e. Confinement practices, that has the effect of increasing the minimum size of a firm that needs to, the minimum size to exist in the marketplace thereafter. And it also has the impact of increasing the price on the market, which decreases the market size. It decreases the quantity for sale. And those two impacts together decrease the number of firms that survive in the market. So you've got larger firms and you have a smaller market. So that smaller market could then accommodate a fewer number of these larger firms. And for that reason, we see evidence that implementing animal welfare regulation increases market concentration. And so based on this theoretical model, we then turn to evidence from California's Proposition 2. It was initially a ballot measure, citizen initiated, which required increased cage sizes for layer hens producing eggs. And what we find is we've got the CR4, the concentration ratio of the 4 largest farms in California is the blue column. The red column is the CR4 of the 4 largest firms in the rest of the US in terms of egg production. And we see that before the implementation of this regulation in California's CR4 was about 0.3. After the regulation, California's CR4 went up to about 0.7. And if you look at the rest of the country, the CR4 for the rest of the US is virtually unchanged. And so we find this result that the goals of animal welfare regulation can be in direct tension with the goals of antitrust regulation or combating market concentration. And so I'll turn it over to Aleks at this point to tell us, what do we do with this information?
Sure. Will you switch over to the next slide, Dan? Thanks. Yeah, so it's important to be kind of precise about what we're talking about here. And here specifically when we're talking about the impacts of these confinement conditions on concentration, we're talking at the farm level. So a lot of times when we're worried about the concentration of the industry, primarily as the presentation before us talked about, it's at the integrator level, and they contract to the farmers, and that's where we get the worry of kind of unequal impacts for both consumers and producers. To be understanding of what the impacts of the animal confinement conditions on industry concentration outcomes and whether that's desirable or not, you kind of got to think about the shape of the supply chain. So on one hand, we've got the supply chain that we studied, which was the egg supply chain, and it is not one of these kind of vertically integrated systems that we've been talking about. It's one of the, you could characterize as a short supply chain where each farmer, or there's many farms, and the farms produce their eggs and then process them minimally and then sell them either to retail or food service. That's in direct contrast to the broiler chicken vertically integrated system with similar to pork and hog. So in the egg supply chain where we're working here, this can have a really negative impact in that it may force this industry as more of these animal welfare regulations come online towards the broiler or pork supply chain. Maybe counterintuitively, when we think about the situation in the broiler or hogs industry, these confinement conditions could potentially have the opposite effect, in that because these regulations happen at the farm gate, that increases the size of the average kind of contract grower. And as we've talked about several times today, these contract growers traditionally have some really unequal bargaining power with these big integrators. As these contract growers get bigger and bigger, they're going to be more able to negotiate with the big integrators, and so we may be able to see some increased equity as a result of these regulations. And then I guess the last point we had about whether this is a good thing or a bad thing was similar to a point highlighted in the last presentation, that as you get a fewer and fewer number of firms, the question of collective action becomes easier. So in addition to making making animal welfare practices potentially easier, the more concentrated farm level could potentially solve several other problems like antimicrobial resistance or wastewater pollution. So there are pros and cons here, and I guess the end here is it's up to the policy maker to decide those trade-offs. We definitely value animal welfare, and animal confinement conditions are important. If you think that if the policymaker thinks that the increased concentration induced by that is a negative outcome, then there are solutions, right? We can try to facilitate the adoption of, or lower barriers to entry, lower barriers to adoption of these compliant confinement spaces. And the way to do that may be subsidies or tax credits. At the same time, those risk running afoul of other laws like subsidies at the WTO. So the solutions it's kind of a complicated minefield. Dan, I think that's all I've got, unless you've got other points.
Yeah, that's all I have as well.
Thank you so much for that excellent presentation, y'all. Really appreciate it. Up next, we have Daina Bray and Owen Pell, and their presentation is about how we can use and leverage the oligopolistic markets to accelerate the end of intensive confinement in U.S. animal agriculture. Feel free to start whenever y'all are ready.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me? Yes, great. Hi, thanks. I'm Daina Bray. I'm the General Counsel of Mercy for Animals. I want to say thanks to the organizers. This has been a fantastic day. And thanks to the panelists. This is going to make for a very interesting discussion that I'm looking forward to. I'm here today with Owen Pell, retired partner of counsel with White & Case LLP And on a personal note, I just wanted to share that Owen was a mentor to me when I was a baby lawyer, and it's been a lot of fun to work with Owen on this project. So thank you, Owen.
Thank you, Daina.
We have heard today about the need for and the energy around antitrust reform from a number of the panels, and this is exciting and critical, and it's a timely discussion. Our proposal is grounded very much in the world as it is today. So assuming that these highly concentrated markets will not be broken up in the short or the medium term, how can we act most effectively in these conditions to accelerate the end of intensive confinement of animals? And there we go. Over the last 20 years, we have seen laudable progress led by NGOs in the areas of education, legislation, and obtaining commitments from companies. Our focus in our paper, when we're thinking about a proposal for change, is to look at 2 of the 3 areas of intensive confinement that have been the subject of those efforts. That's battery cages for egg-laying hens and gestation crates for pigs. And despite the tremendous progress and momentum to end these forms of intensive confinement that we have seen, more than 2 out of 3 egg-laying hens in the US still live in battery cages. Those are cages so small that the hen can't engage in natural behaviors like spreading her wings or perching or nesting. We also see that 3 out of 4 sows in the US still spend significant periods of their lives confined in crates. Those are crates that are only slightly larger than their bodies, so they're not able to turn around or to stand up or lie down easily. The question we're asking then today is, are we at a moment where there is a collaborative soft law approach involving NGOs, companies, and academia that could build on what has been done and help accelerate the end of these forms of intensive confinement? And we heard Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack mentioned in the keynote today. He of course, was the secretary under Obama and will be again in the Biden administration. And we wanted to share this quote because it illustrates a gap that we see in this space. On the one hand, we have consumer preference for less confinement, and we have what I would say is an emerging global consensus that intensive confinement is unacceptable. On the other hand, we have the question of what are the specific paths to and the costs of the necessary industrial changes that would achieve the end of intensive confinement. And I would agree with the secretary that we need a better system and that we don't yet quite understand what that system is. And I also agree that if we don't get into the details of this gap and disconnect, that we run the risk of slowing down the process of ending intensive confinement. And with that, I will turn it over to Owen.
All right, next slide, please. So greetings, everyone. So I'm Owen Pell, and Daina did work for me as an associate, and she was brilliant then, and she's even more brilliant now. So this has all been great. So where we come at this is that past success may not provide an optimal model for continued success. And I think that one of the things worth considering, almost like an additional bullet on this slide, would be that we can't necessarily rely on antitrust law by itself as a blunt instrument to solve the problems of the market. That is, I mean, let's all remember that there are 3 enormous risks of antitrust enforcement. How much time it takes. I mean, think back on the history of antitrust enforcement in this country, not unusual, especially when you're trying to break up a large company, that you're looking at 15 to 20 years when all is said and done, if not more. That because of how much time it takes, the industry may well change during the time of the enforcement mechanisms being pursued, which then leaves you with uncertain remedies or remedies that no longer make market sense. So that raises a real issue of sustainability. And finally, there's always the risk of losing, which then sets you back even further. So one of the things we need to think about is, rather than assuming that we're going to see enforcement in the nature of breaking things up, we might want to consider how NGO industry engagement could work hand in hand with different approaches to antitrust enforcement. So let's assume, and we can go to the next slide, let's assume, based on what we've been told by our speakers, that what is most likely in a new administration is going to be is going to be a change in enforcement vis-a-vis allowing mergers and acquisitions to occur that might engender greater concentration. Let's assume that you could convince a new administration to make greater concentration harder. And let's also assume that you might convince a new administration to engage in certain investigations. And we know that the existence of antitrust investigations changes M&A activity in the market that is investigated. And also data shows that if one country starts an investigation of an industry sector, usually within 9 months, 6 to 9 other countries in that industry have started investigations. So the fact is antitrust investigations are an interesting tool of shaping how capital flows in a market and how people make business decisions. We would argue based on history that if you're looking for sustainability and sustainable results, markets with oligopolistic characteristics offer interesting opportunities. These are markets that are characterized typically by a small number of actors having outside effects, but what you'll see in these markets is a lot of conscious parallelism. They may not necessarily compete that much on price, especially for commoditized items, but they have to find other ways to compete. And usually what they're really looking for is methods and standards. And they follow their own corporate paths based on that. But what you're really going to see, and the papers at this conference have really highlighted it, what we're seeing is that there are remarkably specific microeconomic characteristics to how animals are handled, and it differs by animal and it differs by product. But if we can begin to make certain practices non-standard or viewed as inferior, there is reason to believe that you could literally change how this market looks at the product and how the market treats the product, and that you might be able to actually influence capital formation. And if you influence capital formation, you are going to have that antitrust effect you were looking for, which is you may be able to encourage barriers to entry to be changed or lowered. Next slide. So when you look at intensive confinement in the next 20 years, the question is, what can you do to keep the evolution going? And what can we do, for example, to move beyond commitments? The reason we wanted to highlight commitments is that commitments really show us what we've seen in the marketplace to date in terms of the limits of what are called ESGs, right? Environmental, social, and governance factors for companies. What we know, and there was a great NYU study I commend to you in 2017 about the failure of S, is that almost nobody knows what social means. Nobody knows what the standards are, and what companies mostly do is make commitments but never actually engage with stakeholders, nor do they actually measure actual movement or actual success. They basically set commitments in an amorphous field and then move on. They check the box. So that really tells you that if we could figure out a way microeconomically within these sub-markets within Big Ag to begin changing the dialogue, changing the economic feedback loop, then maybe we would actually have a better way of moving the ball forward on changing how animals are treated in the industrial process. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about a soft law approach. So why don't we go to the next slide? And so so concretely viewed. First of all, there's the issue of auditing and reporting. And this is a really interesting place to talk about the markets. One of the things your speakers have told you, you see in the papers, and it's really good. I mean, the papers at the conference are very strong on this, is that Big Ag is not only characterized by oligopolistic suppliers, but I would argue that there's also a certain amount of oligopoly with respect to buyers. So just as in, say, defense contracting, where you have oligopolistic supply and you have a monopsonistic buyer, being the US government as the primary buyer for big defense, in this market, you have certain oligopolies of buying. And I think the chart that our prior speakers put up about the different supply chains really showed that. There's a really interesting possibility here. So if we want more auditing and reporting, well, one way to do it would be to put pressure on industry. But query whether another way to do it is to examine the government as a buyer. And maybe if the government is in a market buying, and you're in a state that has already enacted animal welfare legislation, well, maybe somebody needs to ask the question, when the government buys surplus supply or excess supply or a certain amount of supply for school lunches, when the government buys, is the government doing anything as to making sure it's buying from people who are carrying out the standards? So in effect, get government as a buyer to buy into auditing and reporting because they've already bought into a standard. And then you've got public data. You've got more public data. Another interesting thought about engagement is going to ESG investors and rating agencies and banks and private equity firms. These are the people whose decisions are increasingly driving industry consolidation, industry vertical integration, and industry investment. If these people start asking better questions and start demanding more data, and by the way, they love data. They love getting free data. And so if they see a way to get more data that would let them assess profitability models or long-term business models of industry, they're going to start asking for that data and they're going to start taking advantage of it. So interestingly, rating agencies and ESG investors and even banks and private equity funds can be a pressure point because they are buyers of information, right? And they may even be oligopolistic buyers of information in this marketplace. And this is an unexploited resource in this space. And that's what we're really talking about here. But there's another flow of money, which a lot of our speakers have talked about, which is tax benefits or exemptions. If we want a certain standard of industrial process that we believe will improve how an animal is treated along the road to ultimate slaughter, if we want to start changing practice, we have to be realistic about the fact that changing industrial practice costs money. We already subsidize certain aspects of the production chain. There is no reason why exemptions cannot be tied to demonstrated compliance with new standards or changing standards. Now, as I think our economist friends will tell us, we all know that subsidies are imperfect. Subsidies do have inefficiencies built into them, but that doesn't mean they don't change behavior. And so one of the things that we've never really examined is, especially in states that have already adopted standards that we like and that we approve of, in those states, are we tying any forms of agricultural subsidy or benefit or exemption from taxes to reported proof that you have met a standard? And if we aren't, then tinkering with that very narrow point, simply getting government to monitor better to make sure you're getting the exemption you've earned, which, by the way, cash-strapped governments actually have an incentive to do because they'd rather take away the exemption and get more tax money, especially now. The fact is, you may make it easier to cause the industry to make different choices because they're going to have to report, right? It's the old civil rights trick. If you don't measure a right, it doesn't exist. And we know that in bureaucracies. That tends to be the way bureaucracies work, and that influences economics. And so what we really end up with, and again, the papers at this conference have driven us to this, is that we need more data and we need more research. And we need to find ways to, in effect, cause companies to be willing to fund that research. In the end, is there a reason to do this? The examples we gave in our paper, and I think the tuna example is actually the best one for this. Look at what happened in the fishing for tuna with regard to dolphins. You ultimately ended up not only getting a change in industrial process, but they were able to use trade law to exclude from the market inferior products. That, to me, is the grail. That's the holy grail. Can I come up with a change to industrial processing of animals where I can exclude products that I don't believe are humane? And what the tuna dolphin example teaches us is there is actually a way to do this if you get the right market conditions and the right microeconomic incentives. And so what we're arguing is that there may be a way to build a better set of feedback loops. And if you build better feedback loops, you may actually be able to move the needle on a microeconomic basis to solve what Tom Vilsack said the problem is, which is getting consumers to take their feelings further down the pricing chain of their buying decisions. Thank you.
Wow, well, thank you so much to each of you for such excellent presentations. We're going to now begin our Q&A portion.